Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to today's session on the human impact of cyber attacks, reframing the defender role. I am so privileged to introduce this panel. Moderating for us today is Nicole Perlroth, and she is cybersecurity author, investor, CISA advisor, and Silver Buckshot Ventures founder. Also joining Nicole is Chris Krebs, Chief Intelligence and Public Policy Officer for SentinelOne, and Bipul Sinha, CEO, co-founder, and chairman of Rubrik. Thanks so much and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, everyone who's here. Can you hear me okay? A little bit, not so great? Okay. How's this? Better? Great. So the title of our session today is The Human Impact of Cyber Attacks, Reframing the Defender Role. And there's a number of ways we can take this. The first thing that comes to mind for me is when I joined the New York Times around 2010, I did a really early story on CISOs. And it was sort of, what is the job like? And the money quote was from a CISO in Arlington who said, "We're like lambs waiting for slaughter." And however, 14 years later, it seems like the situation is so much worse. Yesterday, a CISO said, our job description is to defend organizations from advanced nation-state attacks, sophisticated cyber criminals with the resources of a mall cop, and there's no police force. And now we're seeing some CISOs become targets for SEC actions and FTC actions. So what I hear in the marketplace is that this is not sustainable, that it's time to really look very carefully at what we are expecting from people in these security leadership roles and perhaps reframe what the role is, what the responsibilities are, and what acceptable risk means. And so I'll start with you, Bipul. Rubrik has done some really interesting research this year where they surveyed, I think, 1,600 CISOs and security leaders about sort of the hardships of the role, ranging from sort of the technical to the psychological impacts. So I thought maybe we could start with you just expanding on some of the evidence to back up what we're hearing from CISOs in terms of frustration.
Thanks, Nicole. Pleasure to be on this panel. In our research report, Rubrik Zero Lab, what we found was that 98% of the security team complained some kind of mental trauma post an event. And about 40% of security leadership lost the job after a cyber incident. So when you take a step back, this is not a great situation because the way we have framed the CISO role is wrong. Nobody can 100% stop cyber attacks. You can stop 99.99%, but the attackers have to be right once and defenders have to be right 100% of the time. So the role has to be reframed in terms of, can CISOs continue to operate the services and continue to run the service of the businesses in spite of a successful cyber attack? And that's the true defender's role, not to prevent 100% of the attack. Is think about, like, in the real world, you have if the doctors could prevent all the disease, we'll never need a hospital. But we do have hospitals. It's because doctors prevent vast majority of the cases, but then you have cure in case the prevention fails. The defender's job has to be reframed as not only prevention, but cure.
I just came from doing a moderated session with Joe Sullivan and Tim Brown, who is the SolarWinds CISO. And both of them, it could have been headlined a tale of two companies and two very different situations, but both of them really spoke on a very personal level to the trauma that they have endured with their respective situations, to the point where Tim publicly shares the fact that when he was named by the SEC in their charges against SolarWinds and against him personally, he said that by that point he had done a pretty good job of compartmentalizing the situation with SolarWinds, and he'd had a long career of getting yelled at, and so he felt uniquely prepared for this situation, and he thought he was handling it quite well, and then he had a heart attack. And it was his body's way of saying the stress goes somewhere. And one thing he said that was very interesting was that when SolarWinds was discovered, the first thing that happened was Kevin Mandia called his CEO and explained that it appears SolarWinds was their entry point for their compromise. And then he said the first thing the CEO said when he called him was, "I think we've shipped tainted code." And he said from that point forward, what he did every day was sit on calls with customers and various partners until 11 p.m. when he finally got the daily briefing on what the technical situation was that day. And the reason I share that story is because very quickly the CISO role went from one of being technical and tactical to one that was a strategic communications role, crisis communications. And that's something we're not really preparing CISOs for. And so now I want to direct this question towards you, Chris. We don't have a CISO on stage right now, but Chris led CISA through the, I don't know what we want to call it, mess that was the 2020 election. Can you talk about how your role shifted over that period in November 2020 and what it was like leading a security team through that?
So when I came in to government, it was my second time around. I was in the Bush administration at DHS in the same organization that ultimately became the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. At that point, it was known as IAIP, Information Assurance and Infrastructure Protection, then Preparedness, and then National Protection Programs Directorate, ultimately landed at CISA. But I came in initially as a counselor in March of 2017 to John Kelly, who was the secretary. And I'd kind of done this little drug deal with my wife where I said I'd go into government for a year, maybe 18 months, and it'll help me, skip the line back at Microsoft. I can come back and do, 2 years of government, 10 years equivalent. And I thought I was just going to have some fun, do some cyber policy stuff, and check out. Little did I know that this whole election security thing was brewing in the background. And yeah, you saw kind of what happened through the 2016 election, but the full, I think, impact and the full operation, the campaign, did not really come to light, but slowly in drips and drabs. So you saw some in December, you saw some in January, and it kind of slowly kept coming out. But even then, I don't think the full kind of operation behind. What was really getting the attention was the designation of critical infrastructure, election systems as critical infrastructure. And that happened January 7th, 2017 by Secretary Jay Johnson. So I get in March and I have a stack of papers from governors, from secretaries of state, from members of the US Congress, from state houses, all over the country saying, how dare you try to regulate our elections? And of course that was not what the plan was, but I think I should have gotten the clue at that point that this was going to be a pretty high profile, high protection, or high information environment, but I was clearly naive and clueless. So I stick around, and I even say, you know what, I'm going to go through Senate confirmation, and prepping for Senate confirmation and going through that and waiting on the vote, and then I'm going to wait for the 2018 election, which is kind of the dry run. It's the exhibition game for the bad guys. And then just the ramp up to 2020. At the same time that we're getting ready for the 2020 election, think about what happened in 2020. January 2nd, the US military puts a missile strike on Soleimani of the Quds Force, IRGC. And then we had to immediately go to a shields up position. 2 months or a month and a half later, we're all out here for RSA 2020. And on Wednesday night, Mayor Breed declares a state of emergency. 3 weeks later, at least in DC, all the schools go out, enter COVID. At the same time, the SBR was running through SolarWinds, and at that point, US government agencies. At the same time, you had the FSB, Center 16, the Russians, hitting airports, state and local governments. At the same time, you had ransomware crews making a big push with the Ryuk group. And that went on through the summer, into the fall, and then you add the political element of the campaign. I was really concerned in the summer of 2020 that we were going to DOS ourselves, government denial of service, because we were so overwhelmed with a range of threats that we both controlled or could engage in, and others that we just couldn't anticipate. And the mental health issues that we saw through that time period, both due to COVID and some of the other, you got people working at home, drinking more, substance abuse, other issues on the home front. It was a really significant challenge from a leadership perspective of working with our teams, making sure they had the resources they had. I see a couple CISA folks out there in the audience that were there along with us, and the important part was being there for them, making that contact. We did weekly all hands or town halls of just kind of a rotating basis, just to make sure that everybody was there. And there was a lot of crazy stuff going on. There were the riots over the summer, and it led to some very uncomfortable but necessary open conversations. But it really did strike in pretty stark relief for me the importance of being there for your people, listening, and maybe you can't fix their problems, but at least you can put resources against it. And then, of course, we run through through the election. And the last piece there that I'll say is that it also benefits a team, behooves a team, in fact, to really think through continuity planning. To think through what happens if we have a bad day and we lose resources. We lose people, we lose a network, and in our case, we lose leadership. And I'd had a plan in place. Brandon Wales, who stepped in as acting director for 6 months, and boy, did I leave him a pile of fun stuff to work with, because 2 weeks after I'm fired, SolarWinds, Hafnium, Colonial, JBS. It was a mess, but we had a good team in place, we had a good continuity plan in place, and it was a seamless operation. So you can anticipate, I think, a number of these things. You just have to have this element of empathy and understanding and look out, and don't always get just sucked up and stuck in the day.
So one thing you didn't mention was, and then you were fired by tweet.
I mean, I mentioned it, but...
But that actually was a theme to come out of the rubric research, that one of the most common things, I think half of the respondents said that the most common experience that they shared was that there was a forced leadership change after a security incident. More than half of the respondents said, basically, we needed a fall guy. And I've been very surprised to see that that is still the case. You know, when I first started covering cybersecurity, it was like, yeah, like you were gonna get fired if you were the CISO in a major breach. But then it seemed we reached a point of more maturity where it was, no, actually you want a battle-tested CISO. So it's been surprising to me to see that that's still the common denominator, is that in most of these cases, the leadership that gets you through the worst day of your life and is there for the worst days gets the axe. How do we, what is your thinking on this? And do you see any positive developments on this front?
So if you look at the CISO's job today, or traditionally in cybersecurity, CISO's job are like twofold, risk and threat. So understanding the risk posture, where risk is emanating from, and how do I reduce risk is the thing that CISOs think about. And then the second part is, if the threats get into the environment, how do you track that down and kill that threat? But in both these scenarios, we are still saying that, hey, stop everything. Either by reducing risk, by covering and like creating right surface area, and the other side is something gets in, how do you track that down? But nobody is telling them that how about resilience? That is the third leg of the CISO's tool. It has to be, where CISOs say that I will reduce risk, I will tackle threat, but I also have a resilience strategy. And as this whole resilience is dawning on the boards and executive teams, where board is saying that do we have a bounce back plan? Because if every organization is going to get attacked, it's very unlikely that this organization is not going to get attacked. So if it's going to get attacked, how are you going to bounce back? And that is providing some air cover to CISOs by saying that, hey, now let's think about resilience. And how do we coordinate more with CIOs and operations team to have a comprehensive plan? Because the issue is CISOs can't go and tell the board saying that resilience is not my job, because everything cyber is their job, quote unquote. So this whole idea of bounce back, this idea of resilient organizations, this idea of the CISO's job is make sure that folks have digital trust in the organization by protecting their information, of the customer's information, plus ability to keep the services up and running in conjunction with CIO. So this job is getting broader. My personal view is that the CISOs and CIOs job is going to converge, because there is no IT without security. In some ways, cyber threat is a tax to the digital economy that we live in, or digital life. You can't eliminate tax, you can reduce it and manage it. And that's where this whole job is going to be, that how do we manage this risk as opposed to eliminate the risk.
So many organizations that have undergone these broad automation programs, a lot of it is at the direction of the CIO, but all of the risk and responsibility for that risk falls to the CISO. And one thing that you said, Chris, that was really surprising, it was the first time I'd said it, is that you are starting to see some instances where CIOs are now reporting to CISOs. Can you talk about some of the shifts?
So I think just like the economy itself, companies across the board, they're not monolithic. And it can depend on sectors, it can depend on size and an operational footprint, global, national, regional, whatever. What I think I'm seeing more than anything is that there is from a governance perspective, a bit of a poverty line in terms of what a CISO is able to do and how an organization wants to manage IT security risk. And so kind of below that poverty line, I think it's a smaller organization, so you'll have a CISO and it'll exist in a CISO role, and as you continue to go down, you don't even have a CISO. You may have an IT security director. You may have, at the very bottom, a CIO, but it's almost like the snake is eating the tail, because back at the very top, we are seeing, to Bipul's point, a kind of redefined CIO-CISO relationship and role. I think over a couple years, we had started to see that CISO comes out and from underneath. And I actually, that was an issue that I had to deal with in government, because there were a number of members of Congress that wanted to put into law that the US government CISO reported to the US CIO. And we were making a hard push. They're like, no, this is not how we do it. This is not, you do not want to subordinate the CISO to the CIO, particularly given the way the governance works in the US government. And if you make this, if you put this into law, it's going to set a precedent and standard, and everyone else is going to follow at the state level and throughout organizations. But the key here is that for the governance structure that exists within that company, the way the board dictates, the C-suite dictates, they are the best suited to figure out, what is this arrangement? Is it CISO over CIO? Is it parallel? Is it this kind of conjunction? I am frankly of the mind that particularly in the organizations that have the more diverse set of risks, we're going to just see a chief risk officer that assumes the cybersecurity elements, the physical security elements, the supply chain elements, insider threat, increasingly disinformation risks, and information quality and brand reputation issues are starting to roll up to CROs as they look across the broad risk registries. And now you throw AI into it, and you have this broader set of issues. So I'm pretty skeptical, frankly, about the future, particularly in the wake of the SolarWinds and Tim Brown enforcement actions by the SEC. Fairly skeptical of the CISO as a going concern, as a role throughout the economy. I think you're going to see these fractures and kind of almost stratification of how these roles and responsibilities kind of play out over time.
If you think about how the CIO's roles have evolved, CIOs used to be owner and operator of infrastructure and applications. And in the last 15 years, they have gone from owners and operators of infrastructure and application to consumer of services. And they are consuming cloud service, SaaS service from other places, and creating a portfolio of services to serve the organization. And if you think about this portfolio construction, their job is to reduce the risk of the portfolio. And what is the number one risk in the world as far as the IT is concerned, the technology is concerned, is cyber. So since the cyber is such a central piece of this portfolio construction, it cannot live in isolation. As Chris was saying, that these things will intermingle. In many cases, the CISOs will have CIO as their report, so CISOs will run overall risk function because the fundamental IT has shifted, because it is now portfolio of services.
And here's an example of how I see that shift happening in the next 5 to 10 years. And again, it goes to this, it really depends on the scope and scale of the organization or the enterprise. So the US federal government, the civilian government, not DoD, not the IC, has about 102 different agencies. 102 agencies, from the big CFO acts to the big Treasury, SBA, DHS, all the way down to the micro agencies. And it's like literally the Marine Mammal Conservatory. Like very, very big to very, very small. There's a line somewhere in there. There's a poverty line where under that line, they should not be rolling their own stuff. To your point, the CIO in those agencies is more about delivering services. It's not managing infrastructure, or should not be managing infrastructure. And there's a strong argument that we should be doing what the Canadians have done with a shared services model, where you can configure, deploy, over-the-top monitor, log, and defend email, core productivity services. If there's anything that's kind of like consumer-specific apps for that agency, yeah, let the CIO do that. But if I'm a CIO, that's what I want to do. And I also, if I'm a CISO, I don't want to be doing this on my own, because I need consolidated resources that are coming out of CISA, for instance. But that same model can work in a conglomerate, in a multinational organization, that you have this broader reach, but you want to really simplify and consolidate complexity.
One of the, CISOs are in the hot seat right now with Tim Brown, and we've heard that the SEC may be sending out a questionnaire. Some of you may have gotten it. And there were two questions. One was, were you a customer of SolarWinds, and did you use this version of compromised software? 2, did you suffer a material breach in the last 3 years? And that some of the people who answered that survey are now finding themselves targets of further SEC investigation and maybe quietly settling right now. So right now, unfortunately, this is the situation. And a lot of CISOs who've come to these sessions are raising this and saying, why would I want to take this job? What do we say to those people? I mean, these are 2 cases, they're edge cases, but how do we ensure that we continue to get the best and brightest people into this role?
My take on this is we have made it impossible for CISOs to win, because on one hand, you have organizations holding them responsible for any successful attack. On the other hand, the government is personally holding them accountable on their personal properties and wealth and everything else, and not to mention the incarceration threat. And when I talk to CISOs, they talk about D&O insurance. So directors and officers insurance extended to CISOs. CISOs are going out and buying insurance from their own pocket just to sustain this job. So they are in a no-win situation, and they are both heroes and villains of every organization. So in my mind, when you have like 1 million jobs yet to be filled in cybersecurity, we don't have like top computer science graduates coming into this particular industry, particularly in America. And if you have the top leadership under such a precarious situation, this is not an encouraging place to be. But what I see, the hope for the going forward is that there is realization that we have to reframe the discussion You have to bring resilience as part of their remit, and really think about continuing operation as the goal, as opposed to you stop everything and I'm going to personally hold you accountable.
One of the things that I've been listening for recently is this question of, is the CEO next? If you listen to Ann Neuberger talk about United Healthcare, she'll say, why is it that in 2024 we had a situation where these medical records weren't encrypted? And we're seeing the CEO of United Healthcare out there testifying before Congress. We're seeing Microsoft announce that they're going to start tying financial incentives to security performance. And we're seeing at CISA, Jen is asking CEOs to sign the Secure by Design pledge. So do you see some positive shifts there, that we're making this more of a CEO responsibility?
Yeah, look, I think ultimately there are probably about 4 different levers the government can pull to get changes in behavior across organizations. The first is these voluntary efforts like Secure by Design that will either kind of encourage, compel, guilt, or just by the very nature of corporate responsibility. And even with Microsoft, I'd kind of add that in there. Like I think they had a moment of realization where it's like, hey, we're losing trust. Our customers do not trust us anymore in the government and elsewhere. And so they followed the playbook that they ran in 2003 after Windows XP came out with the Trustworthy Computing Memo. So they're going to replay that, and we'll see how it looks in the execution. But again, this is voluntary, but there's something at risk here. The second is something along the lines of procurement actions. If you want to play in the game of federal government IT, you are going to comply with the standards that are promulgated by OMB and others. And 2 years ago, there was an executive order that really did raise the bar. So you must comply with this standard and NIST this and NIST and OMB that. And again, these are the government using the levers available to them, and this one's power of the purse. The third is regulatory action. You can use existing authorities to go after behavior to get kind of that change in behavior, and we see that in part with SEC. It's civil action against TIM, it's civil action against SolarWinds. We've also seen TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, change or implement cybersecurity regulations in the pipeline industry, in railways. They're going to expand into aviation, and those are based on existing authorities. We've also seen the EPA go after water facilities, but have lost because they overextended what has been interpreted as their authorities. And there's another element here of civil action. So going after software developers and providers, for instance, for substandard practices and negligence. And then fourth and finally, you've got legislative action that is going to implement new regulatory requirements or put some other burden on the provider. And I think that is probably the rarest of the bunch, because it takes a lot for Congress to move a piece of legislation, particularly that affects business in a regulatory sense. But that might not even matter because Europe is passing things like GDPR around privacy. We still don't have privacy law here in the United States. The Cyber Resilience Act, the AI Act. So they're taking steps that are spilling over and cascading. At the same time, you have states here in the US that are passing laws. So there are going to be a number of different mechanisms that CEOs can ultimately be held responsible for outside of what the SEC does, but including what the SEC does.
My take on this question is, again, somebody who grew up in socialist India, I'm against regulations by my nature, but there has to be some framework of shared responsibility. So if you look at the Biden's administration's cyber security guideline, one of the things that was embedded in there was that how do you bring shared responsibility model? So if we are a software provider that provides some kind of a function to an organization, and people buy my software, and if that software has cyber attack issues, then me as a software provider has to have a skin in the game, so that not all the risk is on the consuming organization. the risk is also into the providing organization. So if we create a framework like that where cybersecurity companies or other software providers are responsible financially of any cyber attack that happens on the other side, then it creates the right framework. Because then what happens is that I, as a software provider, I will pay a lot more attention to the quality of my software because I have my financial incentive to be able to do so, otherwise I'll be held responsible when the attack happens. And on the other side, when I sell my software, I will work with my customer to ensure that they have the right controls in place, and for convenience, they are not degrading security, because I am ultimately held responsible. So there has to be some kind of a financial economic structure of shared responsibility model that has to be developed. And I feel like we do ransomware recovery warranty, for example, and when we give warranty, we actually audit our customers' organization to ensure that they have the right controls in place. So in some ways, this kind of a structure is where it should be. And ultimately, if you make the financial as the core choke point, then the CEOs of the organizations will pay attention to it, because their financial results will get impacted, their stock price gets impacted. So ultimately, follow the money and attach to the money, because in my mind, the regulatory efforts are good, but they are post facto. How do we get it up front in the pipeline, so control this thing going forward?
I'm going to change the conversation a little bit. One of the things that has been added to this mountain of responsibility in the CISO role is geopolitics. Just in my own little world, when the Times hired me, they hired me to cover cybersecurity as a technology business story. And one of the first things that happened was we were hacked by China. And I always say that was my Harvard Business School education in cybersecurity. And of course, our CISO, in retrospect, should have been prepared when we're writing really hard stories on CCP leadership to be prepared for a breach of some kind, an effort to find our sources. And now we have new leadership that that is paying very close attention to what is happening geopolitically. This is something that we don't maybe talk about enough, that the CISOs are, the businesses are the new front line. And as a result, CISOs also have to pay a lot of attention and work in geopolitics into their threat modeling. I was just with a group of Fortune 50 CISOs in Washington, and I interviewed the former head of China policy from the National Security Council, Matt Turpin, and he said, my main message to you all is to go home and tell your bosses that in the next 5 years, if you have not extricated yourselves from China, your organizations are going to be in deep trouble. So add that to the job description. How do we articulate this? How do we deal with this? This is not necessarily sustainable.
This is it's a great question. I mean, this is the vast majority of what I'm doing on a daily basis now, both in Pinnacle One as well as with the Krebs Stamos group as I'd left government. But it was almost an extension of what we were doing at CISA, was educating executives, CEOs. This is what Jen Easterly does now, is get out there and talk about the big picture threat of what's going on with China, for instance, in the Volt Typhoon campaign. But it's bigger than that. So I had the good fortune of being able to kind of cut through the hype and the noise in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and kind of decipher what the message was. And it actually wasn't that hard. Russia's going to invade Ukraine, but no one in Europe believes it. Okay, what do I do with this information? Go talk to our clients. All right, you guys have operations in Russia? Yeah, you need to get out. What are you talking about? That's 8% of my global revenue. Well, you're either going to get sanctioned, or Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale University is going to post your name in the newspaper, and everybody's going to see it, and you're going to have activist investors going after you. And some listened, others didn't. Those that didn't, we talked to them 2-3 days after the invasion and the sanctions start rolling out, and they said sanctions don't matter to us. 12 hours later, we got a call from CEO. It was like, all right, fine, we're coming out. Here's the problem. Very few organizations in the winter, early spring of 2022 had an exit an entire geography playbook on the shelf. How do you shut down your entire operations in a safe, orderly manner without putting your employees and potentially future former employees at risk of breaking the law? When you say destroy that server, FSB is not going to like that. These are really hard things that we just haven't really used our imaginations on. So we got through that. First question I got probably midsummer was, hey, thank you for your help getting us out of Russia. That was painful. What's next? China. What happens if China goes into Taiwan? Much different playing field though, right? The business relationships are much, much, much more difficult. It's not hard actually to leave 3% of your global revenue on the playing field in Russia, particularly if your supply chain dependencies are minimal. Now you've got a market and supply chain. So we're working with companies going through what's a de-risking strategy look like? From an IT operations perspective, it's segmentation. It's getting everything separate, completely separate Active Directory. Use their domestic authorities, regulations, to cut it off so they can't get into your global knowledge base. These are things that strategically a CISO did not particularly have, unless you're in a big bank, you didn't have to think about 3, 4, 5 years ago. But now, you need to be waking up every morning paying attention to what's in the news. What happened in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, with the water system there, got hit by the IRGC-linked Cyber Avengers in December, was entirely predictable in October when Hamas went into Israel. We know what what Iran does. We know they go after Israeli-owned companies in Israel and elsewhere. They should have been scanning asset inventory, looking for anything that's broadcasting itself as brand name, which can then be correlated against country of origin. You know these things are going to happen. We have to be thinking forward 3, 4, 5 steps and preparing for these actions, because every conflict from here to the rest of anyone else's lives in this room is going to include some element of technical cyber conflict, information operations. So you have to be thinking ahead. To your point, businesses are on the front line. The homeland is no longer a sanctuary.
Bipul, you're now the CEO of a publicly traded company and chairman of the board. What are you doing in this regard?
So one decision we made in the early days of the company is to only operate in geographical regions around the world where you have intellectual property and transactional governance. Because if I can't be confident that if I sell my product and I'll get paid, I'm not going to do business in that country. And the second piece was, if the intellectual property of the business is endangered, then the whole point of Rubrik is a technology company, software company, intellectual property is everything. So we decided to not go to certain set of countries, but we serve our customers in those countries. The way I think about politics with CISO and cyber is, look, in a democratic society, the trust is the currency. And the reason our transaction costs are low, our interest rates are low on debt, because we have transactional governance and trust. And what cyber is essentially doing is it's increasing the cost of transactions, it's increasing the cost of money. And in some ways, our adversaries are propagating more cyber on us to really increase the cost and create more friction in our economic system, which slows down productivity essentially, because if a coworker calls me in the evening for something, 10 years ago, never used to think it could be a bot, it could be somebody impersonating or a deep fake. But now I have to really double verify, triple check whether it's the right person. So the productivity is coming down, it is impacting the speed of the business. So in some ways, the CISOs and the businesses are on the front line on productivity, economic growth. So this has gone beyond like cyber warfare, espionage, it is really impacting the economy. So we as a society, as a country, has to really take this threat and figure out how we systematically going to go solve for it. Otherwise, it's a long-term issue for our prosperity and way of life.
I mean, look, spot on. I mean, you hit on some of these elements of trust, right? So back about 5-6 years ago, I signed out a binding operational directive for the U.S. government civilian agencies to remove Kaspersky cybersecurity tools that were deployed. And we based it on 3 evaluation criteria. First was the legal structures that Kaspersky was potentially subject to in Russia. And there's a series of laws, one SORM, that would provide the FSB and others access to any data centers in Russia. And that could include, if it's a big data tool that's aggregating data from a number of different endpoints, naturally going to be back in Moscow or otherwise Russia. The second is, what are the technical capabilities? And again, you're talking about root level access on a machine. Really bad things can happen if someone that was a motivated attacker with adverse intentions could get on top of it. And then there are relationship elements. We knew there was a history between Kaspersky and some of the government officials, and so we removed the tech. And it took a while, and then they sued, and there was legislation that was passed. But ultimately, we prevailed in court because ultimately these were national security systems, and it was a national security interest for the U.S. government. But there's a takeaway here of evaluate what your frameworks are for risk management across the organization, across what your span of control is, and then apply it, learn from it, keep moving forward. We can take that same model, and we did from the White House and others, and again with additional help from Congress, to look at risky technology like Huawei that was going into the US 5G build out. And we worked with our allies in Europe and elsewhere to similarly say, hey, this stuff's bad. And it's not just because, frankly, there's a confidentiality issue. In fact, that was probably my least concern with Huawei in the UK or elsewhere in Western Europe. My concern was that this is risky technology that indicates or controls whether the service is up or down. It's an availability issue. And when you need that line of communication, is it going to be there like you expect it to? And you can plan to it. So again, have your evaluation framework for technology, and ideally to the extent you can share with your partners and working with, in these various CISO groups, whether it's a dinner or a workshop, build those relationships. Say, hey, what kind of experience are you having with this vendor or that vendor?
I believe Rubrik has a cyber risk committee on the board. This is new. Some CISOs tell me it's their worst nightmare, having someone with cybersecurity expertise telling them what to do. Some say it's long overdue. What does it look like? What does it mean?
So we started cyber as part of our audit committee. And what we realized was that not only we are a cybersecurity company, but in general, what is the big risk to a technology companies is cyber risk. And instead of having this as a topic within audit committee, it has to be brought at the top as the top thing. So what we did was we created a cyber committee made up of all of the board members, so that we are not only dealing with just the cyber experts, but we want a different perspective on cyber. And the goal of these meetings are not going to the weeds of picking X technology or Y technology. The goal of these meetings is to understand what is an acceptable risk and what is the framework to evaluate acceptable risk for the business. And are we making sure that we are picking the right strategy and right areas to focus on to ensure that we have the acceptable risk framework met. Acceptable risk doesn't mean that zero risk, also doesn't mean that everything is open, but how do you continue to operate the business while keeping your trust in place, while making sure the business is protected?
We've seen us go from, there be no measuring stick to measure a CISO's performance, to we started getting companies like BitSight and Security Scorecard that really look at these organizations from the outside and don't necessarily have an inside-out view. And now we're starting to see more innovation on this with companies like Safe Security that go in the inside and give you a cost of breach and say, hey, if you want to bring down your expected cost of breach, here are the 5 things that you could do to do that. this seems like a positive development, but at the same time, we've been talking about the need for quantifiable risk metrics in this space for decades now. And we still don't have, the equivalent of a nutritional calorie count
Yep.
for organizations. Chris, I'm sure you thought about this in government. What is it going to take for us to get there?
I don't know if we are. I think just due to the heterogeneity of enterprise, the size, the scope, the different technologies, the mishmash, the diversity of products deployed, it's hard to, I think, really arrive or land on a core set of metrics outside of, how are we doing on patching and what's our MFA deployment. So I think it's going to be some of those more, well, since you said nutritional label, probably the low calorie, maybe, metrics. But look, some of the smartest people that I know in the business are working on it and have been working on this. Phil Venables at Google's is very confident that we're going to get there, that we're going to have a core set of metrics, and I want to believe he's right. I think we'll get somewhere, but the diversity, again, of these networks, and I was at a board CISO dinner Sunday night talking about diversity. It was just this question. I asked the board members that are on multiple boards, I said, is there a metric or an evaluation criteria that you see consistently across the various boards you're on? They said, no, not really. It's just the questions I ask. How are we doing? What help do you need? And I said, okay, well, can you, where do you ask that? Is it in a cyber risk committee? Is it in the audit committee? Is it one-to-one for just educational? And some pretty shocking answers. Some said, I'm not allowed to talk to the CISO, which is an immediate red flag. If the CISO can't go talk to a board member one-to-one, then where's the trust? Somebody edits the board slides from the CISO before they go up to the board. There are just a number of these different triggers and red flags, but I think we're going to continue searching. We'll use these proprietary models to start coalescing around a core set, but whether there's a definitive core set standard, anytime in the next couple of years, I hope so. I'm just not sure.
My view is the marketplace will solve some of it. Because if you look at the last 3-4 years, getting cyber insurance has become increasingly hard. And many people who had cyber insurance don't have cyber insurance anymore because either premiums are unaffordable or they are outright rejected. So we are in this kind of turmoil situation right now where the underwriters of insurance are confused as which organizations are better or which organizations are worse because they don't have a criteria to measure it. And this is where I believe that the shared responsibility model will play, because if I have to underwrite and compare two organizations that I am underwriting for, if the one organization has a software provider that is giving some kind of warranty skin in the game, then I have better confidence that they have better technology. Otherwise, everybody says they have best technology, people, best practices. So I feel like as the cyber insurance industry settles, as the technology processes becomes a little more standard, these market forces will force really some way to settle on shared responsibility model, and as Chris said, some way to come up with here are the 7 things that I'm looking at, and what is your maturity model in these 7 things, plus who are your technology provider, and do they have a skin in the game, and that's how the insurance company will force organization to straighten these things out.
Certainly seeing that, absolutely, and what are the core and key controls that insurance companies evaluate for in their 400-page questionnaires that next year will be 800 pages. But it's what is your recovery solution? What's your identity solution? Do you have MFA? Do you have an EDR? I think the next leap is to kind of address that frustration and the friction problem in the insurance process as premiums go up and policies go down in coverage. But it's something that looks more like less a kind of a human-powered survey, but you automate it. And this is where AI, I think, gives us some advantage of just speed and scale of cataloging and inventory and organization. It's kind of like a car with where insurance companies will give you the onboard diagnostics plug and it evaluates the vehicle.
Yep.
Same thing. Insurance companies are starting to use. SentinelOne's got a partnership with Chubb Insurance, where you deploy the agent, it takes a health check of the organization. Then the challenge is, okay, what happens when that EDR starts firing alerts? Who's triaging that? Is there a separate SOC analyst that's looking at it? Maybe AI can plug in there, but that's the direction we're going to have to go to get those real evaluations in place.
We have 1 minute. So I want to bring it back to what are sort of the 3 pieces of advice you might have for a CISO? We hear CISOs talk about get your own lawyer and make sure the company is going to pay for it. Get D&L insurance. What's something else that you throw out there?
Okay, so my 3, first is know your lawyer, know your general counsel, and know who the outside is. I mean, again, I've got a CISO lawyer that was in the room that I talked to probably on a daily basis. I made sure that everything went through the proper checks and we had the right privileges in place. Second is make sure you have a communication strategy and that you communicate effectively and quickly, and it's okay to over-communicate. The worst possible thing you could do is give up control on setting the narrative and let people like Nicole in the media do that for you. We may have had a couple dust-ups back in my day in CISA. Third, also, know your board, communicate with your board, make sure you have that open lines of communication and that you are empowered. Some of these CISOs that are below the poverty line can't write the 8K. That's a problem, that's a red flag, get out.
Obviously, the D&O insurance and lawyer, and make sure their contract is in the right place, particularly for your protection. But number 1 thing I would advise is to get an executive coach, because a lot of CISOs have come from the technical background, and they are able to communicate in terms of the technology and superiority of technology, but the boards and executive teams are not looking at the technology. They are looking at, are you able to communicate risk? And that requires fair bit of executive communication, strategic communication, fewer words, impactful, because you're giving people some kind of a confidence that this thing is running or not running in the right way. So executive coach, I would say, is number 1.
And I'll just, in the last 3 seconds, to Chris's point, get friendly with a good reporter right now so that when your security incident happens and your lawyers are telling you to shut up and not talk to anyone, which only creates an information vacuum that the media will fill, you can have an off-the-record, on-background conversation and make sure you define what that means with the reporter, where you can offer valuable context. And when you do that, I teach a Stanford GSB class on this. When you do that, you have a very small window of opportunity on day 1 of these incidents. You use that opportunity to shift the narrative from one of victim blaming, shaming, to one of, we are in the most complex digital threat landscape we have ever been in. Companies are up against advanced nation state threats and an advanced ransomware economy, and I'm not the only one who's up against this. We need to change the game. And if you have a good relationship with a reporter, they will help tell that story instead of the one that says you didn't do your job correctly. So that's my 2 cents.
Spicy take. Close this out.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.